Hello again, and welcome to another of Huddersfield Local History Society's 2020-2021 season of online talks. Today's speaker, Dr. Alice Brumby, is a lecturer in modern history at York St John's University. Her research specialism is in the 19th and 20th century history of mental health care. In this, she has made a particular study of our local Stalls Hall Hospital, at one time the largest or one of the largest mental health hospitals in the whole of the West Riding. Her topic today is both poignant and shameful. It deals with the long-term mental health damage done during the First World War to thousands of British soldiers. What today is diagnosed as post-traumatic stress disorder and treated, we hope, appropriately, was then called shell shock, and some of its victims were treated at Stalls Hall. Alice will tell us the story of 6 of them. Alice.
Hello everyone, and thank you very much for choosing to listen to my talk. I was very honoured to have been asked to what was initially come to speak to you in person um, about my work, because it's something that I'm hugely interested in. And I've taken this talk to a few places and it's often got quite a lot of interest. But above anything, it's a local story. It's a local story about Huddersfield, and that is a central part of what I want to talk about today. So my name is Dr. Alice Brumby. I currently work at York St John University, but I also have huge connections to Huddersfield University too. I studied my PhD at Huddersfield University, and that's where I started to uncover the stories that I'm going to talk to you about today. I've titled my talk Veterans' Voices, Stalls Hall and the Long Shadow of Shell Shock. I've called it that not just because it's really difficult to say if you say it quickly, but actually because this idea of a long shadow of shell shock, the reason why I call it that is because we're all aware, on some level or another, everybody is aware of the story of shell shock. The idea of servicemen getting ill during their battles during 1914 to 1918 and becoming shell shocked is well known. It's a story that's been popularised in literature, in poems, and films. We've all heard of Siegfried Sassoon. We've all read the work of Pat Barker or come across her. And we're all also very well aware of the events on the front which led to the breakdown of men during the war. I was always really perplexed, however, as a student, by the fact that this narrative appears to be a 4-year narrative, that the story somehow closes in 1918, that the men miraculously get better or certainly disappear from the history books. And so, what I wanted to find out and what I want to talk to you about today is what happened to the ordinary Tommy after the armistice? What happened to the men who broke down during the war, who didn't recover in that short window of 1914? What happened to the men who were left to try and pick up the pieces of their lives? I should point out at this stage that all the images that I use as part of this have come from Wakefield Archives. I'd also like to point out that because of the case closure records, the fact that medical cases are closed for up to 100 years, I will only refer to these men by their first names and perhaps an initial. I'll never use their full names because I'm not going to disclose their identities. So that's where I'm going to start my talk. So my talk today is going to focus on life after shell shock and the institutionalised veterans after the First World War. I'm going to focus on one institution, and that's the institution you can see on your screen now. Many of you will recognise this institution. It is, of course, or it was at the time in the picture, Storrs Hall Pauper Lunatic Asylum. During my talk though, this institution has a different name, and that'll become important. So I'm not going to refer to it as Storrs Hall Pauper Lunatic Asylum. I'm going to refer to it as the Ministry of Pensions Hospital, sometimes referred to as the Ministry of Pensions Hospital in Kirkburton. This is really important, and it's a huge landmark shift that actually shows the relative importance of Storrs Hall. So the Ministry of Pensions, after it was operating, basically asked Storrs Hall whether it could annex part of its building. And so it did. The dining hall and a further wing of Storrs Hall was annexed from Storrs Hall to become what was supposed to be a separate institution, the Ministry of Pensions Hospital. And this Ministry of Pensions Hospital, or this annexed institution, was opened in 1924. As the title suggests, it was set up and run by the Ministry of Pensions. It was run specifically for the benefit of mentally afflicted servicemen. They were the only people allowed to be part of this institution. There were only 2 of these in the country, one serving the north and one serving the south. So you can already see that this is a special institution. This isn't just Storrs Hall. This is an annexed, separate institution within the grounds of Storrs Hall. Now, this was really important. It was a hospital and not an asylum. It was set up just for ex-servicemen, and it was supposed to get rid of the stigma of mental illness. It was opened originally, when it was opened, as a hospital for what was called quite the hopeful type. And it's also fascinating for another reason. It's fascinating because Wakefield Archives holds vast casebooks for the patients that were in the Ministry of Pensions Hospital. And these archives are really special. They're not the usual casebooks, which, though full of interest and insight though they usually are, they're full of something more important than that, which usual casebooks for Storrs Hall, certainly that I've seen, doesn't have. The archives are full of letters from the patients, and these letters can help inform us about life for these men. It can give us some indication of how they felt and what their experiences were. Now, I just want to add a bit of a warning here that some of the stories that I'm going to talk to you about today are deeply moving. They are very upsetting. I'm going to talk to you at the end of the talk about a case of suicide, along with a whole host of different experiences. But I do think this is really important. These letters give us this huge insight into ways in which disability was framed during this period and how the ex-servicemen responded to their incarceration. I believe that these stories are too important to simply ignore. Now, as I mentioned earlier, this was a hospital that was set up for, quote, the hopeful type. However, despite this, it seems that many of the servicemen in this institution remained there uncured until the hospital finally closed in 1931. I find it very interesting how many of these patients were not just suffering from war stress, which was the new terminology for shell shock during the 1920s, but also other causes as well. So war stress comes up for all of them, but often other factors are attributed. Hereditary is another position that's used quite a lot in the case notes. It's interesting because there's a huge fascination for eugenics during this period, particularly in asylums. And so frequently in the case books, when we're looking at why people are there are other things noted as being what's wrong in their families. So 23-year-old Percy H, for instance, was noted as being an epileptic. His father was an alcoholic. James L was noticed that his father had been in, ironically, Storrs Hall for many, many years before this. And similarly, this chap here, James G, was noted that his sister was also in an asylum. In addition to these patients, others were considered to be what was at the time referred to as feeble-minded. And this term feeble-minded, I think, for me, raises huge doubts about why they were admitted into war service in the first place. So feeble-minded at the time meant not suffering from mental illness at all, but often suffering from what were often perceived to be very severe learning disabilities and learning difficulties, which makes me wonder, what are people with these huge learning difficulties doing, being called up to the front? So, for instance, 35-year-old John L was described as being very feeble-minded with very little intelligence, is dull and simple. Similarly, this chap here, 30-year-old John W, it's noted in his casebooks that his mother observed that, quote, ever since he left school, he has done very little work, goes about giving his clothes and money away. So people were in for a whole raft of reasons during this particular period. The patients are suffering from all sorts of complications, from epilepsy to learning disabilities to other things as well. And in the parlance of the time, in the 1920s, these are illnesses that are not uncommon in casebooks already. And because of their diagnoses that they've been diagnosed with, it becomes apparent very early on that very few of these people are going to be cured. Very few of them are going to be cured at all. Now, of course, you don't just need to be cured to leave an institution such as this. In fact, there are many ways to leave such an institution. So you can see on the screen here, there's quite a few different ways. So death, escape, transfer, discharge, to be discharged recovered or to be discharged relieved to friends and family are also ways that you can leave an institution. However, as this table on the screen here shows, very few left the institution in any of these ways until the hospital closed in 1931. So the table that I've created here is a table of just literally the first 100 cases in this institution. So taking the first 100, what happened to them? And you can see that the vast majority of them were just moved along after the hospital's closure. In fact, taken together, you can see that only 19% of the patients recovered enough to be discharged in any of these ways. Now, to put that into some perspective for you, the national recovery rate during this period is 35%. So 35% as the national recovery rate may seem quite bleak, but it's certainly a lot more chance, you've got a lot more chance than the 19% that we can see here. Now, I wanted to show you this table because I think this table, this hopelessness that these patients found themselves in, from the very backdrop of the letters of the patients that I'm going to share with you now. So many of these letters highlight the kind of marginalized individuals. They highlight individuals who are critical of the hospital and what they consider to be their imprisonment within it. That notion of imprisonment comes up quite a lot. So Thomas Kay, for instance, is quoted in the casebooks. He thinks this place is a first-class prison, and he thinks he's been confined here for being a conscientious objector. Similarly, James G. reported that he is suffering here and that this is not a hospital. To give you another indication, what you can see here is a very detailed letter written by the patient Joseph B. This patient writes to the popular periodical at the time, John Bull, and tells them of his desperate situation. The letter effectively says that he feels like he's dying in the institution, and he's basically sending an appeal to John Bull to raise a national alert as to his situation. It's very much a protest for his release. He says at one point that he thinks that he hopes that they'll get the letter before he dies. And of course, the poignancy to this is that, well, is that I unwrapped that letter. I opened that letter out of its stamped addressed envelope. The very fact that the stamped addressed envelope remains in the casebook shows that this is a letter that was never passed on. It was merely kept almost as evidence by the superintendent of the institution at the time. And I find that quite sad because here's a patient basically saying, I'm hoping I'm not going to die before you read this. And here's me as a historian reading a letter of a man who's evidently died before anyone's read this letter. And again, this is why I find my work, I feel a little bit like an archaeologist sometimes, even though I'm a historian, trying to piece together these people's lives. Other patients developed powerful identities to resist the hospital authorities. So this chap here, Walter S., is 50 years old. He's from Liverpool. He's described in the case notes as being very deluded and full of absurd beliefs. His delusions as to his position at the Ministry of Pensions Hospital continue as before. Now, amongst many letters in the file, this letter includes this one. It's been typed up and sent back to the institution. The letter reads, "Gentlemen, ye surprise me to think you would all be so backward and slack. This department has been opened for housing in their little homes pensioners that had lost all from the 1914 trouble. I opened this place for housing of pensioners that wanted homes 2 years and a half ago, and not one pensioner, to my knowledge, has been housed yet." Now, seemingly for this patient, the title of Ministry of Pensions Hospital led to somehow this belief that he was indeed an employee of the ministry. Now, that might be interesting, but in some ways it's not unusual. Many patients develop pseudonyms and titles and positions during their stay at the institution. So 40-year-old Ernest B, for instance, was adamant that he was a member of the Border Control. Now, the Border Control at this period, to put it bluntly, are a little bit like Ofsted for schools today. They're the watchmen that go into institutions to check that everything's okay. So Ernest B is adamant that he's a member of the Border Control and no one has any right to detain him. Further, this chap here, James G, believes that he has the right to close down all the asylums. He claims he's the advisory medical officer, and that he's got the right to do this. It would seem that waiting for medical officers to declare them recovered led to many seeing institutionalisation as some form of game. So my next patient, Lucas C, was almost notorious, and I can tell this from the vast amounts of notes on scrap paper that are linked to his casebooks. Notorious for writing little notes. He finds scraps of paper and writes them. The first that he wrote was in 1926, when he writes to the Bristol War Office. He writes, "This is to certify that I do hereby resign from the Bristol Army. You must not take every man to be a bloody fool." After no response from this letter, however, his next letter becomes more frantic. He writes this: "This is to certify that I do heavily demand high damages off the War Office for this nuisance going on around me. I am king of this empire and I am not having this. We'll have this case got into as soon as I get away from here, hoping that to be soon." Now, despite this protest, unfortunately for Lucas C, the game did not end, and he's one of the many patients who was simply just transferred from the Ministry of Pensions Hospital to another hospital in 1931 after the hospital was closed. Now, I'd like to point out here that not every story is a sad one. Some patients did recover. Some managed to use their own agency to secure their release. So 37-year-old William Arthur, for instance, was transferred to the Ministry of Pensions Hospital in 1924. He'd come from Prestwich Asylum, where he'd been an inpatient for 3 years without any improvement. On admission in his case notes, it was noted that he had, quote, "delusions that his skin has peeled off, has delusions that he has syphilis, he's dull and depressed, he says that he's responsible for the misfortunes of other people." However, only 1 month later, William appealed to the medical officer for his release, and he starts the process of negotiation that we can see here. This letter's fascinating. It reads, "Dear Sir, I would like to ask you a question with a view to securing my discharge. I take it I'm only being held on account of being so unconvincible. I should have been less so. There's no one that's fought harder with oneself as I did try and master the ideas and notions of which I did have. And I must say, I've had more satisfaction whilst I've been here. If that's the only obstacle in my way, I see no other alternative but to be convinced and have a bid for home. I hope you'll accept these few lines and take a satisfactory view of them." Now, the casebooks tell us that this letter was actually hugely successful. Shortly after the letter is dated, William is granted a month of parole, which is not uncommon during this period. They'd grant a patient a month to see how they did in the outside world. That month of parole was successful, and as a result, he was discharged relieved. So there is some success stories. Similarly for this patient here is 50-year-old James F. His admittance to the Ministry of Pensions Hospital tells us that this is his second attack of insanity. This time it's noted to be linked to war stress. He's first admitted to Wakefield Asylum by his wife in 1919. He spends 5 years in Wakefield Asylum with very little improvement. However, having said that, when the Ministry of Pensions Hospital is opened in 1924, he seems to make quite an extraordinary recovery. So literally 4 months after his hospitalisation at the Ministry of Pensions Hospital, it's noted in his records that he remained well and was fit for discharge home. Now, certainly James himself seems really happy with his treatment. The next day he writes this letter to the superintendent. He writes, "Dear Dr. Graham, just a few lines to let you know we got home safely. So all's well that ends well. Thanking you for all your kindness shown to us. I will conclude, dear sir, with best respects to yourself and all your staff. Yours respectfully, James F." Now, although these cases are rare, I do think it's really important to showcase these cases as a counter-argument stories. There are indeed stories where patients leave the institution and are evidently quite happy about their treatment there. So I think it's important not to say that, not to forget these stories in the rest of my talk. Now, as I mentioned earlier, leaving relieved or leaving cured is only one method of leaving. And as we've seen, for many of these men, they don't recover, they aren't cured. So for these men, there are options available to them, and many availed themselves of it. Escape was a particularly I was going to say popular, but that seems like the wrong word. Escape was used frequently by these men. Many of these men had large amounts of parole. They had quite a few freedoms bestowed on them by the institution. They were able to walk freely in the ground. They were able to walk to the local church every Sunday for church service. And so for these men, often actually it would appear that many of these men found escape quite easy. Escape and recapture, however, proved a little bit more tricky. So James G's report of transfer, for instance, basically said that he'd made several attempts to try and escape. Similarly, this chap here, Thomas L., had tried many, many times to escape. So in 1925, this 45-year-old managed to escape by forging, this is my favourite, this letter from the Ministry of Pensions Hospital asking for his release. You might be able to see there, but basically it's a forged letter claiming that he's from the Ministry of Pensions Hospital and basically asking for the patient to have a small gratuity of £5 a week for life. Now, evidently, this was a forged letter. Evidently, the Ministry of Pensions don't really write letters that look like this into the 1920s. It's interesting because whether this letter helped or not, he did actually manage to escape. So this is found in his casebooks along with this is dated November 1925, and in November 1925 it's noted in the casebooks that he escapes. He is, however, found at home the next day and brought back by attendants. Still unhappy, he tries again. He leaves the institution this time on a return visit from church. Again, he's found and brought back to the institution. After this misadventure, it is noted that he remains quiet and industrious on the wards for a while. That is, of course, until 1928, when it's noted that he, quote, absented himself whilst on parole. Again, after being returned, he got questioned by the medical officers at the time, and his response was that he left because he was depressed at his long detention. Now, for these men, escape appears to be one of their main ways that they could try and escape from the confines of the institution. And I find these stories of escape and the letters that link to them fascinating, about men that are clearly resourceful, men that clearly have an understanding of how they can leave the institution. I also find it mesmerizing that on so many occasions, the men are found so quickly because they go home. They don't go into hiding, they don't go to a superfluous place, they go home. And I think this shows a lot about the agency of the men. It shows a lot about how they're thinking and how they're feeling and how they use their agency to try and get what they want. However, it does unfortunately get sadder than this, because when these men feel like they have no agency left, when they feel like they've lost all their power, things start to turn really badly wrong for these men. And what I want to share with you now is perhaps the saddest part of this talk. It's a collection of letters, and there's a collection of letters written by a 24-year-old named Francis G. These letters show a really emotional narrative. They show what could happen when men lost control over their lives and their identities. Evidently unhappy at the location of the Ministry of Pensions Hospital, Francis basically requested to the authorities to be moved closer to his relatives. He wanted to be moved from the institution where he was at to an institution closer to home. Now, this letter gets moved around between the authorities. The letter is initially written to the Board of Control, and the Board of Control passed this letter back to the Ministry of Pensions. It seems that nobody quite knows what to do about this request. Eventually, there's a letter in the case books by the Ministry of Pensions, and the Ministry of Pensions declare that, quote, no useful purpose would be served by transferring him. Now, after Francis receives this news, shortly after that letter is dated, again the dates in the case notes show that he tries to escape. His escape, however, is also similarly foiled. Finding escape to be of no avail then, and finding the request to be moved institution to be no avail, he tries to end his life. The first time he tries to cut his own throat, and the second time he tries to strangle himself. In a letter addressed to his mother, it shows the deep-seated pain and emotion at being kept away from his friends and family that he clearly felt. The letter's really sad, it's really moving, and it reads thus. Dear Mother, I'm sorry if I have to end my life like this, but I cannot stand the pain any longer. Only God and myself know what I have suffered. I do not wish to impose on you or any of my sisters or relatives or companions. They have all been very good to me. I'm going to do this for the best, and I do not want you to think that I am out of my mind. You will find me coming as a corpse to your house some day, and my only desire is that you shall not mourn me, as I am the one who suffered most in the family. Good night and God bless. I remain your broken-hearted son. Now, if that letter's not heartbreaking enough, perhaps even more distressing than that is the PSN note, which shows what Francis thought about his treatment at the hospital. It ends like this. One of the orderlies here has called me such names that I think it better for me that I should depart from this world, so as I can get peace, which I have not had for years. Now, this is a really, really distressing case, perhaps the most distressing case that I've found in all of the cases that I looked at. To me, not only does the case of Francis tell us the fluid and versatile responses that a patient could adapt to assert some control back over his situation. Firstly, to write an appeal, secondly, to escape, and thirdly, to try and end his own life. Each of these shows a thought and a thought process that links to some agency. These are not just men to whom things were done to. These were men who actively tried to change their position, actively tried to assert some control over their bodies. I also think it's one of the most harrowing tales. There's no way of knowing the truth, and this is a problematic case in many ways. So I don't know whether Francis succeeded in killing himself or not. Certainly when he leaves the institution, he's fine. However, the rub is that the date on the letter is after he leaves the institution. I don't know if the letter comes back to the hospital. There's lots of mysteries surrounding this case and lots that can't be known. Similarly, the allegations about the orderlies and the treatment that he's received at the hands of the orderlies, it's clear that these feelings are real though, and it's clear that in his desperation he's driven to the desire to end his own life. Now I want to end there because I think I've kind of shown the whole bandwidth of the cases, from those that are cured, those that create their own identities, those that try to escape, and those that try to do the last thing available to them. Francis's story is just one of many narratives, and the narratives of the men that you can see here, which can be pieced together through the letters and the casebooks. Using the letters and the casebooks together can give us this really deep insight into what's going on. It helps us to highlight some of the diverse responses of the patients to these situations. And I think, far from being passive, voiceless puppets that they're often kind of deemed to be, what we can see from my talk is that these are men with agency, men with an ability to adapt. They were able to develop an extraordinary array of responses to their institutionalization. And I think it tells us a lot about shell shock and mental illness that continued throughout the interwar years and what happened to these men. It's a tragic story, but it is, to me, also a story of hope, that these are men that just didn't give up. They kept trying. Now, I've shared with Christine a longer journal article which I've written up is open access. And if you're interested in it, if you're interested in this, then please feel free to read the journal for more information on all of these cases. Just want to end then by saying thank you so much for listening to my talk. I really hope you enjoyed it and I hope that you got something out of it. I want to say a big thank you to Wakefield Archives and the lovely archivists that work there, that helped me so much during my PhD, and the wonderful resources of the archives for containing these stories. I've also just put on there my email address. Should you wish to get in touch with me, that would be absolutely lovely. So my email address is on the screen too. Once again, thank you for listening.
This talk has been one of Huddersfield Local History Society's 2020-2021 programme. We are a membership society and it would be very good if you could come and join us. But if you can't do that, given these difficult COVID times, you can visit our website. There you'll be able to find out what we do, who we are, and what sort of events and publications we have. Thank you for coming and listening to the talk. We hope to see you again next time. Goodbye for now.